Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this online discussion by the Free to Disagree campaign. Today, I'm joined by two allies of the campaign, Josie Appleton, the convener of Manifesto Club, and Emma Webb, who's a political commentator and the director of FIDE, a project of Civitas think tank in London. Thank you for joining me, both of you. I'm just going to begin by asking you to say a little bit about yourselves and also why you decided to join the Free to Disagree campaign. So Emma, maybe starting with you, can you introduce yourself and say a bit about your work and what brought you to support our campaign?
So as you mentioned, I'm the director of FIDE, which is a project that sort of looks at the intersection between issues to do with extremism and integration. One of the things that we started out with at the beginning of the project, when it started at the beginning of last year, was looking at the Islamophobia definition proposed by the APPG on British Muslims, which was a big debate in England specifically, but has a lot of resonance with what's going on with the hate crime bill. So there were a lot of sort of shared issues and concerns, everything from sort of the threat to free speech to how vague this was and its effects on civil liberties more generally. So that's sort of where I'm coming from the Civitas perspective. But the reason why I got in touch and wanted to support your campaign is because I think that I don't think it's possible really to understate the threat posed by the hate crime bill, particularly the way in which it seeks to try and manufacture men's souls, I guess, by legislation. So I think the thing that is implicit in what the Minister Hamza Youssef has said is that what they want to do is to create a better Scotland by censoring people's actions and speech that is regarded as abusive or offensive or insulting in some way. And I think what's implicit is that they want to try and create a better Scotland by eliminating, as you've said in previous interviews, that or using the phrase Orwellian is a bit tired out and overused. But to use the Orwellian term wrongthink, what they want is crime stop. They want it to stop up here. They want to eliminate prejudice from people's minds. And I think that's the thing that I find most concerning, because the corollary of that is always going to be various authoritarian measures that I'm sure we'll discuss in the process of this conversation. But I think that is the authoritarian impulse that all of these other problems arise from, and it's something we've seen in the UK. And if this were to pass in Scotland, this would have implications for all of the other countries within the United Kingdom. And that's the reason why I think that you can't overstate the importance of your campaign pushing back against it.
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask you a bit more about that later. I'll ask Josie just to say a bit about herself before that, and the Manifesto Club, and also her motivation for getting involved.
Sure. We campaign on the freedom issues of everyday life. So very much the freedoms in the intimate sphere, in public spaces, and very much coming out of a recognition that perhaps there were new forms of state restriction, which really affected what people could do and say and the way they could relate to one another, but that weren't seen as maybe classical civil liberties issues. They weren't seen as kind of harder stuff people would see, like terrorism law and that kind of thing. But I think for us, there's very much an absolute importance to informal relations, to the way people associate in a public space, the informal chats, and that kind of whole ground of civil society, which is being increasingly mediated and controlled through state regulations. So whether that's requirements to get a license before you can busk in a public space, or to hand out leaflets, all the kind of ways in which before you can do anything in public, or before you can relate to someone, you require state control. And I think this is very much part of that trend. And free speech is absolutely fundamental to any kind of free civic relations. If you can't say what you think, then you can't be yourself in public. You can't actually have a public debate or public sphere, and you can't arrive at civility or at truth or actually a reasonable respectful relations between each other if you can't say what you think. And I think that the thing Emma mentioned about teaching people to have the correct opinions, I think those correct opinions can never be actually good. They can never be a genuine respect for other people, or have a genuine tolerance if something has been enforced. So if you have a kind of enforced respect for a certain group, then I don't think you can actually have a genuine respect, because it has that artificial quality of something that is sanctioned, and people are kind of questioning themselves whether I should say this or say that. And I think actually at the moment we're actually having a moment of, really quite, in some ways, quite rapid shift in public tolerance towards various groups. And I think that these measures go against that, and really control that. And I think, this particular law is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I read a lot of really bad, expansive laws, and this has got to be up there with the worst. My worst that I saw was the offence of possessing inflammatory material that you have, if you had a view to sending it, and if you did send it, then it would be likely to stir up hatred. So it's kind of that's a hypothetical offence. It's not just a thought crime; it's a hypothetical thought crime. You have a book on your shelf that you have a view to send to someone or whatever, and if you did, then I think that just the kind of expansiveness in terms of the broadness of what they're talking about. So they use the word insulting, for example, which is very, hasn't been used in any kind of very problematic, already very problematic laws that exist on this subject. So insulting has been used in very broad categories, and then just these kind of extrapolations, which really I can't see how anybody would not be committing a crime underneath this. And what happens when that occurs is not that everybody actually gets prosecuted, but that they can get anyone they want. And so they have essentially a free hand. The police will have a free hand to get anyone they want. And so that will be, the most very broad grounds for discretion. So for whatever reason, that's a personal reason, or somebody becomes unpopular, or there's a bit of a spat on Twitter, or whatever, they can get somebody. And it could be imprisoned. That's the other thing, which is, very scary. So no, I think this is a real landmark in terms of threats to freedom of speech, and it's an absolutely very vital campaign against it.
Yeah, well, these are obviously all familiar concerns, which we've discussed a lot in the last few weeks. Emma, did you have any thoughts on what Josie said there that you want to come back on?
Yeah, I think so. Just on some of the last things that Josie said, that the sort of Salem mentality. I know that a lot of people have brought up the issue of vexatious claims, that this is something that could be used maliciously, and that the groups that are mentioned, the categories, will inevitably come into conflict with each other. Religious groups versus certain sexualities and so on will inevitably end up attacking each other, and there will be conflicts there. But I think that we would be naive to think that the I'm going to call it the Salem mentality of, you covet your neighbour's cow, and so you want his patch of land, and so you make some kind of claim that he's been communing with the devil, and it's something that can't be proven or disproven. And I think this is something that has been raised as well, which is that the lack of the requirement of intent means that you can't really have a fair trial, because it's not something that you really did. It's almost in an intangible realm, very much like in the Salem analogy. And obviously this is an outlandish comparison, but there are stories from, say, the Maoist Cultural Revolution, where someone said that they made an accusation against their neighbour that was, a vexatious claim. It was done maliciously, and then their house is raided and all of their property is taken because they're seen as a traitor to the revolution. And obviously that's a very extreme example, but it's the same impulse that we would be naive to think that we don't have, sort of almost by human nature, that there will be people who will make malicious claims. And if the police have the power to search someone's house and seize material just on the basis of these claims without them even having been charged, it's something that is very alien to Scottish law. It's very alien to, you know, law in the United Kingdom, full stop. And it's a very sort of foreign authoritarian impulse. And I think that the way that this is almost, it's very cynical, but it's almost as if somebody had wanted to write something that was open to abuse, you couldn't really do much better than this.
Yeah, well, yeah, I noticed that you've used the term authoritarian a couple of times, and Josie's talked about hyper-regulation, which again is a similar theme. You've also used the term, Emma, blasphemy. So you've talked about how it's a sort of new blasphemy law for the 21st century, and that's something that other members of the campaign have talked about. What do you mean by that exactly? Because it's interesting, isn't it, that there's an offence of blasphemy being repealed by the hate crime bill, which hasn't been used for more than 100 years, obviously. But at the same time, they're enacting another law which is going to see certain kinds of speech made criminal in the same sort of way. So yeah, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's almost satirical, isn't it, that the blasphemy law that's being repealed is being repealed partly because there's no chance that you could never prosecute somebody under that law in the 21st century. The last person in Scotland, I believe, who was convicted for blasphemy under that law was someone who had put offensive postcards or some kind of sign in his window that were viewed as disgusting and insulting, and that he was the last person to be convicted of it. And of course, as Josie was saying, that's actually not too dissimilar from the sort of thing, you know, displaying something in your window could very well fall foul of this new law, except the danger is this new law is a blasphemy law that would actually see prosecutions. It's just that it's not protecting religious beliefs as previously and as we would recognize from blasphemy laws, but it's these new sacred ideas, protected categories that are decided by the state, because you could separate human beings into an endless number of categories that you could say are protected. Blue eyes, brown eyes, you could carve us up in any which way, but these are sacred ideas that are part of a broader phenomenon in the UK, although to some extent also in Scotland. You've had some issues with attacks on statues, for example. And there is seems to be a general movement towards trying to purge all elements of our societies of anything that offends these new sacred ideas, whether they're statues or music. We've had that problem in England with our institutions in the British Library and the British Museum, wanting to remove busts of Beethoven because classical music is viewed as white supremacist. And it is something that has a momentum of its own. And I think in this sort of divisive atmosphere, and as Josie mentioned, civil liberty issue, that this would create, I think, distrust between communities, because people wouldn't be able to discuss things. And once the discussion is removed from the realm of possibility, because people are too afraid and uncertain about what might fall foul of a law like this, then this idea will just escalate. Things will just drift to the extreme, because that's what happens if you remove discussion from the public sphere. So I think the comparison to a blasphemy law there is that, you know, there are these sacred ideas that we're not allowed to transgress in public debate. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, you know, Toby Young's free speech union has so many people needing to use it, because people in their everyday life, everyone from J.K. Rowling to somebody working at a small company nearby, you know, people are, their livelihoods are at risk. And if you have a law like this, that just gives the legislative power behind it.
Hmm. Josie, I'll give you a chance to respond to some of that if you want to.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. And I think whenever the state introduces mechanisms to mediate between groups or individuals who are apparently having disputes, then it always makes those conflicts worse. So if you look at kind of we've done a lot of work on antisocial behaviour powers, which are supposed to sort of deal with neighbourhood disputes, and actually in every case, they aggravate it 100-fold, because it means that people don't actually mediate that discussion themselves, and they essentially go through the legal power. So essentially somebody presenting themselves as an opinion group or whatever, once you have this kind of legal power, what they will do to present themselves is actually to try and use this power to suppress criticisms of their position. So rather than being pro-Islam or talking about, the meaning of the Quran or whatever, they'll become an anti-Islamophobia campaign, and they will essentially spend their time finding everybody who's been critical of Islam and trying to get prosecution of them. So in a way, it kind of pushes everybody into a position of not being for themselves and not being positive about what it is they have to say, but relating through the state and becoming quite dependent upon the state for the presentation of their own point of view. So, a Christian or an atheist becomes less concerned with actually the meaning of Christianity or secularism, and more concerned with suppression of opponents through state regulation. So I think it actually has a very harmful effect on people using the power as well as those receiving it, because it makes you dependent upon the state and makes you put your case in a negative manner and not a positive manner, and means you become actually detached from what it is you do believe, because you don't put it forward in a positive manner. So I think the effect of these laws is very harmful on all kind of sides, and I very much agree with Emma about the kind of historical context of this. And I think in modern states, the idea of any kind of thought crime has always been an anachronism. So it's never really fitted. So I think for the early modern state, treason was the fundamental basis. The crime of treason was the fundamental basis of the state. It really needed the crime of treason, and that was a kind of the absoluteness of the king's authority. But when you have a modern state, then all of these thought crimes become shameful, really, and they don't really fit with the way things are supposed to be done. So you had in the UK, you had blasphemous libel, obscene libel. So you had certain kind of maintenance of certain kinds of crimes of opinion, which were essentially having the wrong opinion, but they never really fitted, and they always, like, so for example, the obscene libel had to use the Lord Chamberlain to censor. So it's a very kind of shows you basically it's a feudal system if you're having to use a member of the Queen's household to enforce a law. So I think that really the idea that you regulate thought crime is a feudal idea, not a modern idea. And whenever modern states invoke it, it's always it's always something surreptitious about it. And so I think that really the move back in of these thought crimes so you had the kind of waning away of blasphemy and obscene libel and that kind of thing. And the move back in of thought crimes in terms of hate is based on that old idea in a way, but there are certain different things about it, which is that it's not, I think the old libels were basically about defending establishment opinion that was sort of Christian, moral, so it wasn't explicit sex. There was essentially a centrality of kind of decent opinion. And I think that although what Emma talks about is the kind of new orthodoxy, it is a certain orthodoxy, but it isn't in the same way, in the sense it doesn't have that kind of same centrality to a society, like people kind of believed that that there shouldn't be obscene publications. It was something that was popularly supported. There was something about it being the pillar of common belief. And I think the thing now is that doesn't exist. And so you very much have a kind of, a relatively small clique with a certain set of opinions that they are trying to enforce on other people, but in a way that doesn't have that same kind of bedrock element. So it's quite a different quality to, I think it is basically a feudal idea, but it has quite a different quality to old thought crimes and the way that they worked. it isn't an establishment in the same way that actually has a kind of popular base in society. So like the Lord Chamberlain, when he was censoring, he always used to say, you know, and they would issue instructions to plays about, you know, how short the ladies' skirts could be and exactly what swear words they could use, and they were very detailed instructions on what you can do in the play. But he would always say, you know, what would a reasonable adult opinion be on this subject? So what would the average person think? How will the average person think? How short should her skirt be? You know, so it was a kind of grounded censorship, I suppose. And I think the interesting thing now, not the concerning thing in many ways, is the rootless censorship, the rootless nature of the censorship. So things, for example, some of the things about transgenderism, the correct opinion is so far from people's lived reality and belief that, you know, it's kind of extraordinary that something has become unsayable that most people would think in quite a short period of time, in terms of a woman as a woman or whatever, you know, that certain, so you have certain, the nature of current censorship is quite detached. And so I think that makes a bill like this even more dangerous, because I think that you couldn't rely on someone like the Lord Chamberlain essentially being representative of what most people think. And so then at least there's a kind of democracy to the censorship in terms of it represents kind of current mainstream opinion. I think a bill like this, it would actually could be used really by an elite to actually repress what most people think. So very much against the kind of mainstream view. And it's incredible how many subjects there are where actually the mainstream view has become unsayable, whether that's on Brexit or transgenderism or whatever. So I think that kind of holding of the instruments of censorship and public discussion by a relatively small clique, which are very detached from general opinion, means that if there were to be bias used in the enforcement of a law like this, then it would be it would be very much against the majority in the way that it would be used in a very anti-democratic way, which makes it kind of more worrying.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I think that point hints at the distinction between the existing stirring up of hatred offence, which is on race, and these new offences, because obviously society has come to a consensus that racism is wrong, and we accept that, and that's why it's worked so well in the law for so many years. But these new provisions being on different subjects, which are a little bit more subjective, one might say, like the transgender identity one, which people really dispute and debate, that society has not come to a consensus on that issue. So you can see how it would risk criminalizing both sides of the argument, if you like. Emma, I have a quote from you from an article you wrote for Con Home, which I thought was really good and really, really interesting, where you say that the implicit and dangerous idea with this bill is that you can change hearts and minds with law and build a particular vision of society by limiting expression. You slightly touched on that a bit earlier on. That's interesting, because the Scottish Government itself regularly says that the bill is about sending a message. And one of the points we talked about last week was that this is an increasing trend in Scotland. Other legislation in the last few years has been used to quote unquote send a message to the public. And, you know, the campaigns I've been involved with have said that that's an improper use of the criminal law. You don't send messages, political, philosophical, or otherwise, through the law. The law is something that has to be clear and has to be non-political. So if you don't send messages, if you like, through the criminal law, how do you change public attitudes? I think all of us in this debate would accept that prejudice and hatred are real, and that there are, you know, people need to be won over to acceptance and tolerance of different people, and to I suppose not be prejudiced and hateful. So how do you think that the government, the state, should engender that kind of attitude? Or do you think the state should engender that kind of attitude? Or, you know, how does society learn to deal with these kind of problems that we have, and the sort of hatred and abuse that we do see in society?
I think it's cultural. So I think that you mentioned the politicization of, using the law to send a message, which is a completely improper. That's just not what the law is for. You shouldn't. If you're using the law to send a message, then something has gone very, very wrong along the way. But I think that one of the worrying things about this bill, and not just this bill, but actually it's more of a general problem. It's in every country. We see it all the time with international organizations trying to dictate the way that people use words, because they think that words are so powerful, that if words are that powerful, then the only way that you can really change society is to try and alter the way that people say things. And I think it's partly to do with changes to our societies over the last 50 years maybe, and the decline in cultural cohesion, I guess, that these are things that manners are supposed to deal with. This is something that is for culture to deal with, not for the state, explicitly not for the state. The state shouldn't be trying to interfere with these things. So if you look at, it's the same with the proposed Islamophobia definition in the UK, where in the UK Parliament, but I think it probably would have only applied to England. I think that's what they were after, England and Wales. If you look at that, it's the same with the hate crime bill, that there are already sufficient laws to deal with the things that meet the criminal threshold. What they're trying to do is to create legislation and definitions that go beyond the criminal threshold into things that are simply not for the law to deal with, not for criminal law, not for the state to involve itself with. So I think that, firstly, the obvious thing is this isn't for the state or for law, but also it's something that is to do with culture and manners and personal responsibility. The church, who have come out against the bill, would accept that prejudice and discrimination is a moral wrong. But in our public debate, because to some extent, because this new ideology, a new orthodoxy has taken hold, we no longer talk about things like individual responsibility, moral values and duty, and moral things that are moral wrongs and moral rights. Our culture has changed so much in the public sphere. I don't think so much within private, within families. I think this is still something, and that is reflected actually in the opinion polling that you carried out, that showed generally that people were in favor of the old understanding of, if you're inciting racial hatred, then that is if you're inciting people to violence, if you're inciting people to commit a crime, then that is what is slightly different from just saying something that is offensive or might be regarded as insulting. So I think that it does still exist, and it is reflected in many areas of polling, the difference between the people in general and the people within our institutions, who are the ones who are the small number of people who are perpetuating this new orthodoxy. So I think that it just simply isn't for the state to deal with. It's a cultural thing, it's for manners, and they should just stay out of it. The question of how we develop a culture that is respectful in a meaningful sense, going back to what Josie was saying, because the respect that's mandated by the law is just simply not worth having. I think actually the only way that you can engender that culture, a good, decent, moral, respectful culture where prejudice and hatred and tensions between communities gradually and organically ironed out over time, that this kind of legislation is the absolute antithesis of the sort of society that would engender those kind of relations between groups, meaningful respect. So I think the state staying out of it would allow this to organically develop. But it is something, like I say, it's something that's not for the state, which means it's more complicated. And it's just simply not something that you can legislate for. And if you do try to legislate for it, what you'll end up with is tyranny.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying there. And something that John McClellan said in a previous interview was that education is another important sort of aspect of that, both in the home and in schools, and encouraging young people and leading them along and helping them to think through stuff and come to their own organic decisions, as you said. Josie, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been a massive expansion in the role of law. I mean, law that's supposed to make people polite, that's supposed to bring about a better society. I think in a way, law has become the mechanism of social transformation, and replaced also a lot of public state services, for example. So with antisocial behaviour legislation, you see a council that wants to kind of make an area nicer, and they don't build a new playground or whatever. They ban spitting. So it's through the kind of coercive intervention that the state makes an area nicer, rather than through a form of public provision or whatever. I mean, I think there is a genuine problem of I think, you know, some of the kind of socialization and mechanisms for civility that did exist in society have waned. And so, you know, there are neighborhoods where really, you know, there isn't much civility or respect or whatever. But I think that every time you introduce a legal mechanism to deal with that, then you make the problem worse. And I think that essentially the legal mechanism is very, very limited in terms of what it can do. So the sociologist Max Weber said, you know, a very, very small part of social order comes from the operation of law. A much greater part comes from the exercise of shame, of morality. And so the idea that you can build a society through law or through criminal legislation, you know, is completely wrong. Like a very, very small part of the way things work actually should be about coercion. Coercion should be like the last thing, like the absolute bottom line. Like you kill someone, you break into their house. You know, it basically has to be a category of action that is so violatory that becomes the appropriate way of dealing with it. But everything else, every other form of sanction, cannot be dealt with through those forms. And I think that when you try and deal with it through those forms, as Emma says, the idea that this is going to create mutual tolerance is absurd. I mean, it's going to have the absolute opposite effect, which is that everybody's going to start petitioning for the restriction of other groups, and they're going to have absolutely no respect for each other's opinion. So I think that the more freedom that can be given to civil society to rebuild some of the relationships that have been damaged over the last couple of decades and that are being damaged partly through legal intervention, then the better things will be. I also dispute the idea that Scotland or anywhere else is a very hateful society. I mean, I don't spend much time in Scotland, but I don't suspect it's that different from the rest of the United Kingdom. And really, actually, it's never been, really? Okay. You know, it's never been less of a problem in my memory of racism, or it's been so much easier to be gay than ever before. You know, obviously there are problems, but, you know, really, society is becoming a lot more tolerant, and that's a really good thing. I think that the more people, the more interracial marriages, the more spaces of free socialization, of free exchange of ideas, then the less intolerance and those prejudice will exist. I think prejudice exists largely from unknown elements, but also from forms of conflict which exist through economy, but primarily through state structures right now. So I think that these laws actually create an objective conflict of interest between groups, and they become the problem in a way.
Yeah. I mean, what you said there near the end about Scotland not being full of hatred and prejudice is something that was emphasised by other speakers like Kevin McKenna, who's a Herald columnist. And yeah, he disputes the idea that there's waves of hatred all across Scotland. And part of our discussion with him was about how the idea that society is full of hatred is predicated on really social media, which is given an undue influence, really, because there's only about 10% of people in Scotland on Twitter, and only a small percentage of that small percentage are the abusive, hateful type. But it seems to be creating a wider impression that society is full of warring factions. And of course, there's the whole debate about identity politics and how that interacts with everything, but it's probably something that's a bit too big to get into in this particular discussion.
I just say, I think on the idea of there being a society full of hatred, I think that there's something in that which is very anti the mass of people. You know, that it's a kind of idea that the kind of that most people are this kind of seething mass of incorrect opinions, and that they need to be educated into enlightenment. And I think that's a completely false idea, and it's mainly promoted as a justification for those who want to be the restrictors and the educators.
Do you think that, so the political classes in the UK, so in Holyrood and at Westminster, what do you think's behind their desire to enact this sort of legislation? Do you think they're really moral crusaders and they're wanting to change society's views, or do you think they're just responding to a societal expectation almost that, yes, well, of course we're against prejudice and hate crime, so we must do this? You know, do you think it's a knee-jerk thing, or do you think it's something that's premeditated and thought through, and that they do want to use legislation to change culture?
I think they probably would. I think that the idea of society being full of hatred is probably maybe a subconscious idea, or it's not. This stuff, it doesn't have a sort of proselytizing quality about it. It's more, they would see it as
reactionary.
Yeah, a kind of reaction to the circumstances. So there are these problems, and the idea that they can make a statement. I think their idea actually is less to send a message about to other people than to make a statement about themselves.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost like a kind of Facebook.
Call it virtue signaling is something that's often talked about.
Well, exactly. So law as virtue signaling, or law as a Facebook post or whatever by the Scottish executive. You know, I think it has that kind of self-promotion kind of quality as well. Of this is what we stand for, and we're making a good Scotland and a better society, etc. So I think that there is a lot of just self-justification on the part of the state authorities.
There's a bit of irony there, isn't there? Because the government in Scotland is always talking about how Scotland is such an open, tolerant, welcoming nation, and it's always been that way. But then on the other hand, you know, we're full of hatred and prejudice, and we need to enact tough criminal legislation to stamp out this hate and prejudice in this tolerant country. So it's slightly mixed messaging there from the government. Now, I'm aware of the time, so as we wrap up the discussion, what's your message to people who are watching this today? So obviously, one of our main goals is to bring the public into greater awareness of what's going on and to encourage them to take action. And we think it's vital that people do speak out and get involved and interact with the democratic process. What's your message, or what's your wisdom on how people can best make their views known and try to change the outcome of this legislation at Holyrood?
That's a difficult question, isn't it? I think it's kind of part and parcel with everything that's been going on, is that it is very difficult for people, normal people, to involve themselves in the circles that are kind of, you know, behind this and other pieces of legislation or political action that are similar. I think normal people, and this is not just in relation to the hate crime bill, but more generally, I think there will be opportunities that present themselves where people will be able to make their opinion clear if they disagree with the orthodoxy that is encapsulated within this bill. And I think that often people naturally, and it's completely right that they do feel this way, will feel cowed by the pressure to conform with these ideas. And as you were saying, that, you know, it's a very difficult question. I think that probably people should try to take the opportunity to speak out when they can, to make it clear that that you can't change hearts and minds with legislation. and where there are opportunities to involve yourself in the democratic process, whether it is locally or through your MP or through your MSP, that people should do that. They should write to their MPs, make their views known, seek out opportunities to try and amplify their voices if they disagree with what's going on. Because I think, as I mentioned, it's easy to stay in the shadows when you can be made to feel fearful by the pressure that already exists even without the legislation. And so the only way to kind of relieve that pressure is actually for people to come out and try to make it clear that the mass of people, as your statistics showed, are against this, but also that the mass of people are reasonable, that it's not that they are pro-hate, it's not that they are racist and prejudiced and that they don't want to have that, you know, taken away from them. Because like you were saying, I don't think that there is some sort of conspiracy with the people behind this bill. I think it really is just that the consensus of what hate crime means, and it's almost a kind of moral and legal consensus that we have worked our way towards now, is the thinking behind this bill. The current thinking seems to be that it is acceptable to use the law to send a message, that it is acceptable to punish people for stirring up hatred without intention. And I think the normal people need to make it clear that they don't agree with that, and that there are democratic channels to do that. And you've been doing an amazing job with this campaign and showing people how they might be able to, you know, get involved in the process. There are means, you just have to seek them out.
Yeah, as you say, it is a difficult question, and I think something I pick up quite a lot is that people are discouraged because they feel like the political class just doesn't care about what they say, and previous legislation in the Parliament has not commanded public support at all. And, you know, sometimes it's been that all the polls are massively against it, but they press ahead anyway. So that creates an impression in the public that politicians don't care, and therefore, you know, why should I even bother? And I think that's something that's dangerous, because the whole point of democracy is that, you know, it's collective, and people should be able to have their voice heard and share their views. So we want to really encourage people just to take action, and the more people that speak out, and the more obvious it becomes that there's a consensus against this, I suppose that might create the kind of pressure that we need. And
it doesn't help that this is all being done during the pandemic, so that people can't actually, even though there are people who have been going out and protesting, people can't involve themselves in the way that they might usually, because they're limited by the restrictions, especially in Scotland, where the restrictions seem to be even more strict than in the UK. And Nicola Sturgeon seems to be pushing at the same time for stricter and stricter rules around the pandemic, whilst also this is taking place. And I think that actually that doesn't respect the democratic process properly. So really, people should be writing to their representatives and saying, we think this needs to be put on ice until it can be done with proper scrutiny.
I really agree about that. And I think that almost like the more democratic the opposition can be, the more local, the more multidimensional, the better. If it's something that people are talking about at home, if it's something they're talking about in the pub, if there's a stall at the town square, I think for the campaign not to be, just about campaign groups or whatever in the kind of that world, but for it to be something that actually people.
It's a movement,
A movement, recognizing that actually this is what affects what everybody can say and think. And I think actually that would be a very rich campaign for free speech with all those different kind of dimensions, and would really make the cause of free speech a genuinely national popular one, which I don't think it is at the moment. I think that Emma's right, that there's a kind of, on the one hand, a fear of I can't say that, on the other hand of, well, what's the point? I'm going to get it anyway. And then free speech almost like bursts out in a sort of, in hatred because of those repressions almost. I think that, the more national popular the kind of campaign can be, and the more different dimensions, and people thinking that almost anything can make a difference, then I think the richer it will be. But as Em says, it's very bad times for that. Very bad times for organising anything in public. So
yes, it's not ideal. But yeah, I think there is, I've said this before, that there is a wider significance to a campaign, although it is very much focused on the legislation on hate crime. I mean, free speech is just something which everybody is thinking about, you know, just now and over the last few years, and people are alarmed at a wider chill on free speech and freedom of expression through various things. So it's a conversation which we want to add to and help facilitate as well. I think we'll call it a day there because the time's going on, but thank you again for joining me, and all the best with your work. And yeah, do keep sharing our campaign materials and fighting the good fight.